So the first biogeochemical cycle I want to mention is the water cycle, also known as the hydrologic cycle. And in this cycle, it's simply the movement of water through the atmosphere. Now, when you look at a picture of a globe of the Earth, you know, about 75% of Earth's surface is covered with water. But there's a problem with that water. Most of the water on Earth is undrinkable. It's either too salty because it's ocean water, or it's frozen like in glaciers and icebergs. So the vast majority of Earth's surface is covered in water, but it's not drinkable water. So we really need to understand how the water cycle works so we can take care of the water that we need to survive. So let's look at the stages of the water cycle. You know, water rises into the air in two ways. One, the most obvious, is evaporation. Heat from the sun causes water vapor to rise into the air. So liquid from the pond, liquid water, turns into a vapor and rises into the air. A second way that water rises into the air is through what's called transpiration. Plants will lose water through their leaves. That's what transpiration is. So when we look at transpiration in a little more detail, plants have these tiny openings called stomata on their leaves. Here's a leaf. Let's zoom on in. And when we do, we see it almost looks like an eyeball. We're zoomed in here, really highly magnified. This is an example of a stomata here. It's a tiny pore, microscopic, where water vapor can exit. So this is how water exits during transpiration. So when we look at our cycle again, water is rising through evaporation and transpiration. Well, what happens is, of course, water collects in the atmosphere, and eventually it's going to condense and form clouds. And so when we continue on with our hydrologic cycle, now that there's water vapor in the atmosphere, condensation occurs because as water rises into the air, it eventually encounters cooler temperatures. You know examples of condensation on a hot summer day. For instance, let's say you take a soda out of the refrigerator and leave it outside for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, you come back and there's these little water droplets all over the soda bottle. Well, did water leak out of the bottle? No. Moisture in the air, water moisture in the air came in contact with the cold bottle and it condensed and formed these little droplets. So the same thing happens is when water vapor rises into the air, it cools and condenses and forms clouds. Clouds are the effects, the results of condensation. And then once clouds are formed, that will lead to some form of precipitation, the falling of water back to the surface of the earth. And when it comes to precipitation, it might be the most obvious type of, such as precipitation of rain, or of course there's the precipitation called snow, precipitation called sleet. It's kind of like it's not cold enough for snow, not warm enough for rain. You get this mixture of slushy material called sleet. By the way, sleet is really slippery to drive on for all you young drivers. So if you're ever caught in a sleet storm, pull over, get some lunch, and wait the storm out. And then there's hail. Hail is the fourth type of precipitation. Little chunks of ice can fall to the ground. And when you look at this person's holding hail balls in their hand, you can imagine these things are falling from very high altitudes and they could cause bodily injury or even property damage. You see, here's a broken window. The back window of this automobile has been broken out because of hail damage. So if you live in areas that constantly get hail, you may want to look into hail insurance. And so once water is on the ground because of precipitation, one of two things will happen. Either it will run off downhill, and runoff is simply when water runs downhill into a river, into a lake, into an ocean, or the water will soak into the soil, and that we call that infiltration. And when water soaks into the soil, it begins to collect underground in this big pool of water underground called groundwater. And that's where a lot of the world gets its drinking water from, is from underground groundwater. And so when we look at this picture here, we can see that there's a cutaway of the earth. We can see the groundwater underneath the surface. Well, what we'll do is we'll drill wells down into that groundwater, and then we can pump the water out of the ground and use it for our everyday needs. So how come these underground supplies of water don't go empty? Well, that's because of infiltration. The groundwater is recharged or resupplied or restocked because of infiltration. If water didn't seep back into the groundwater, we'd run out. So the purpose of this final slide on the water cycle is to show just a summary of the two ways that water goes up, transpiration and evaporation. And eventually that leads to clouds condensing and forming. And when water vapor gets too heavy, it condenses and then it falls as some type of precipitation. When water hits the ground, it will either then run off downhill or it will soak into the soil as infiltration. Either way, I hope you see we have a nice cycle. And again, this is simply the hydrologic or the water cycle.